Hello and welcome you all friends. Today we are going to discuss the data collection methods. You would recall from our last lectures, from our earlier lectures that the choice of data collection method basically was the third step in the research process, and it follows after the choice of research design. So once we have frozen the research design, you decide the data collection method. So now let us have a detailed look at the data collection methods. But before that, we need to understand what are the various types of data that we'll be collecting through our research. So basically there are two types of data. The first one is called the primary data and the other one is the secondary data. But then let us understand now what is primary data. Primary data is the new data that is gathered for research purpose. So it's a new data which is being gathered for the purpose of research by the researcher, and it is being collected by the researcher himself. Now this is very important. It is collected by the researcher himself. It also means that it may so happen that since collection of primary data is a very time consuming activity, so the researcher may also deploy some field workers to go and collect the data. So that will also be part of primary data only. Now it is very important to understand that since the researcher himself or his or her field workers are going to the field to collect the data, collection of data is going to be time consuming. It would be time, cost and labor intensive. What do we mean by this? It is going to cost you more time, it is going to be more expensive to collect. Apart from that, it would require more number of people or more number of man hours. You'll have to put in more efforts, you'll have to put in more man hours, or you'll have to deploy more manpower to collect this data. But then why is it used if it is not very efficient in terms of the money that is required for collecting the data, in terms of the manpower that is required, or in terms of the time that is spent on collecting data? Then why in the first place do we use it? We use it because it is more attuned to the research requirement. See, the researcher is himself collecting the data, and he is collecting the data for his own research. So naturally the data that would be collected would be more relevant to the research being undertaken by the researcher. What are the various sources of primary data? We have had a brief look at these sources earlier also. These are basically surveys, observations and experiments. So today we'll be discussing the first source, that is the survey. But before moving on to that portion, let us understand what is the other type of data that we use in our research. As I already mentioned, the other type of data is the secondary data. Now let us understand what a secondary data is. See, primary data is the new data which is gathered for the purpose of research, that we have understood, and it is collected by the researcher himself. Now in many cases it may so happen that the data is already available somewhere else. It may so happen that some government agency might have collected that data. It may so happen that some research agency has that data. It may so also happen that some other researcher has already collected this data. In this case, if you are the researcher and you want the data which has already been collected by these entities, what will you do? You will simply source this data from these people, from these entities. In this scenario, now the data that you have sourced from some other entities, from maybe other researchers, from maybe other organizations, other research agencies or government agencies, this data will now be called the secondary data. So the main difference between the primary and the secondary data is, while the primary data is collected by the researcher himself for his own research, the secondary data is originally collected by somebody else, and then the researcher who is conducting a research, he finds that the data which has been collected by somebody else is relevant to his research. He will simply source this data from that particular entity or person or organization. In this case, the data that has been sourced from somebody else would become the secondary data. So this is the difference between the primary and the secondary data. Let's have a look. Use of data collected previously for some other purpose. Now this is the data which is which has been collected by somebody else for some other purpose, you are simply using this data, you are simply sourcing this data from that entity, from that person or organization, and you are using it in your own research also. Now this becomes the secondary data. So it is generally collected by others. If the data is being collected by the researcher himself or his field workers, then it would become the primary data. Naturally, if you are using the data which has been collected by somebody else, you don't have to spend too much time, you don't need too much, you would not require too many people working for you, and you would not also have to spend a lot of money, and that is why secondary data is generally cheaper and faster. But then there's another problem. There's a problem with secondary data also. It may not be completely relevant to your research, because naturally it was collected by somebody else for his or her own research, and now you are simply sourcing it from him. It may not exactly suit the requirements of your own research, and that is why you may have to rely on primary data, even though it is costlier, more time consuming, more expensive. Okay, now let me give you an example. Suppose I want to find out, let's say I want to find out what is the adult literacy rate in Pithoragarh district of Uttarakhand. Do you think you have to conduct your own research? Do you think you have to conduct your own research? You have to collect your own data to answer this particular research question? What is the adult literacy rate? I hope you understand the meaning of adult literacy rate. Adult above 18 and literacy rate, how many people are literates? So what is the percentage of people above the age of 18 who are literates in Pithoragarh district? If I want to understand this, if I want to collect this information, collect this data, would it make sense to go to the field, to actually go knocking at every door in Pithoragarh and then collect the data? Probably it would not make any sense, because you would understand that this data would already be available with the Census of India. You understand that census is conducted by the government of India every 10 years. Last census took place in 2011, the next one would take place in 2021. So this data is already available with the with the Census of India, and I would simply take this data from there. So for my research purpose, this would become the secondary data. But suppose I need to find out what is the adult literacy rate among government, among people who are working as agricultural laborers. If I want to find out what is the adult literacy rate in Pithoragarh among those people who are primarily agricultural laborers, primarily into agriculture. Now this data would not exist anywhere, and probably I will have to collect my own data, and then it would become my primary data. So this is a difference between the primary data and the secondary data. When you borrow somebody else's data, it becomes secondary data, and when you collect your own data, it becomes primary data. We'll not be dealing with secondary data in this video lecture, but later on also we'll have a look at what are the various sources of secondary data. As of now, we are going to mainly focus on the primary data, and within that also we are going to focus mainly on the survey method of collecting the primary data. Now what is a survey? Generally what happens in a survey, please understand: use of questionnaires to gather facts, opinions and attitudes from respondents. We had understood in our last lecture that what happens in a survey. Do you remember? In a survey I told you that there's a researcher and then there is a respondent. Respondent is the person who is answering, who is responding to the questions which are put up by the researcher, and there is an interaction between the two. So the researcher interacts with the respondent, researcher puts up questions, and the respondent responds to those questions. So this is what generally survey is, and we had understood that generally surveys are conducted to gather facts, opinions and attitudes. So you go to the respondent and find out some factual information from him, or maybe what is his opinion towards a particular event, towards a particular development, towards a particular issue, or maybe what is his attitude towards a particular product, or maybe towards a particular individual, or towards a particular idea. So this is what you tend to generally want to find through surveys, and for this you use questionnaires. Now please understand what questionnaires are. See, questionnaire is nothing but it is a list of questions which you would give to your respondent. Now this is very important. Questionnaire is a list of questions through which you would want to find out some facts or the opinion or the attitude of the respondent, and you actually give away this list of questions to the respondent. The respondent reads the questions on his own. Now this is very important. The respondent reads the question on his own and then he marks his responses. This means that to be able to administer a questionnaire, what do we mean by administering a questionnaire? Giving it to a respondent and collecting his response. To be able to administer a questionnaire, you have to be very sure that the respondent is literate, because he will have to read the questionnaire on his own and then he'll have to mark his response. So he should be able to understand the questionnaire. He has to be a literate, and he has to be at least a mature individual. So you cannot give away your questionnaire to a child who is just 4 to 5 years old. He would not be able to answer your questions, not because he is not literate. He has already started going to school. He might be a literate, but then he would not be able to understand your questions. So you are not going to give it to an immature individual. So the two conditions which are there are, number one, the respondent has to be literate and he has to be a mature individual. Then only he'll be able to answer your questions. So you understand what a questionnaire is now? Okay. So using of questionnaires to gather facts, opinions and attitudes from the respondent, this is what surveys are conducted for. Now there are different types of surveys. Let us have a look at these different types of surveys. Number one, door-to-door. At times it is also called face-to-face survey, wherein the respondent and the researcher or the field worker who is collecting the data for the researcher, they both interact face-to-face. They both have a live interaction face-to-face. The respondent gives away the questionnaire and the questionnaires are then filled up by the researcher gives away the questionnaires and the questionnaires have to be filled up by the researcher. So this is what a door-to-door survey is. And how do you conduct this survey? For example, I want to conduct a particular survey in Pithoragarh district. What will I do? I literally go knocking at every single door, every family I'll visit, every household I'll visit, and I'll request them to respond to my questions or to fill up my questionnaire. So this is what a door-to-door survey is all about. The second one is a market intercept. Now what is the meaning of intercept? You understand, intercepting is stopping something in between. So what do we mean by market intercept? Basically, market intercept means that you are stopping the person who is likely to respond to your questions. He would likely be your respondent. So you stop your respondents midway when they are visiting the market, and then you request them to fill up the questionnaire. This becomes a market intercept. So you understand what happens? You stop, you simply intercept the respondent when he's visiting the market, or he's visiting maybe a mall. In that case it will become a mall intercept. A discount store, if he's visiting, it will become a discount store intercept. So you go there and you simply at random pick up your respondents, request them, stop them, request them to fill up your questionnaire. This becomes a market intercept. Now you can understand what is the difference between the two. Which one would you think is going to consume more time, door-to-door or market intercept? Suppose you want to conduct a survey, you are doing a research in Pithoragarh, conducting a survey in Pithoragarh, and you have to find out how many chocolates does a family consume every month. So which of these two types, which of these two methods of survey is going to be more efficient for you? In door to door, you will have to actually visit the families in their homes and then ask for their responses, while in market intercept you are simply stationed at the market and you see the respondents coming, and then you stop them midway and you request them to fill up your questionnaire. So you understand that the market intercepts are going to be much more efficient, and you would not have to move long distances as a researcher when you are going for market intercepts, and that is the reason why we generally have market intercepts. Third one, executive interviewing. You know who executives are? They are by the term executive, what do we mean? We mean people who are from the middle or maybe top management at the supervisory managerial post, and they are people with experience, 10, 15, 20 years of experience, people at very responsible position in the government or the civil administration. So you talk to them. These people are called executives, and when you interview them, this is called executive interviewing. Now what will happen in an executive interview? It is very much like a face-to-face survey. The only difference being that in a face-to-face survey you can put up your questions to anybody. He or she or the respondent need not be an executive, need not be a executive working with the government or a public or a private organization. He can be a wage earner, he can be a rickshaw puller, he can be a normal shopkeeper also. But while you are doing your executive interviewing, you simply, all your respondents will have to be executives. So what is the purpose that executive interviewing serves then? There has to be some purpose, otherwise why do we have executive interviewing? See, executive interviewing is done in those cases where we need to gather some data, collect some data from people who are executives. Let's take example of a particular research question wherein we have to find out what is going to be the impact of artificial intelligence on jobs. Would more use of artificial intelligence and systems and computers and devices based on artificial intelligence, would they lead to creation of jobs, or would they ultimately lead to reduction in overall jobs? What is going to be the impact? Now naturally you cannot put up this question in front of somebody who does not have this kind of an experience, in front of a normal shopkeeper. He may not be able to respond. Many of the people may not even know what artificial intelligence is and how it can impact the job scenario. You naturally will have to go to some executives, senior executives who are very much experienced, and then you can collect their opinion. So in such cases you go for executive interviewing. I'll give you another example. Suppose I want to know what will be the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the long-term GDP growth rate of our country. Now naturally I'll have to talk to some executives. I'll be talking to maybe senior executives working with private firms. I might be talking to senior executives working with PSUs, public sector organizations. I might also be talking to various government functionaries, maybe the secretaries and the deputy secretaries in Government of India. So these are the people who I would contact to collect this data. In this case, executive interviewing is only going to serve you the purpose. Another type that we have is called the telephonic interviewing. Now what happens in a telephonic interview? You can understand the interview is conducted over the telephone. And what is the main reason we have telephonic interview? Because you want to save your time, you want to save your money as a researcher, and you don't want to employ too many people working for you. So in such cases you might go for telephonic interview. What will happen in a telephonic interview? You will have a telephone directory and this telephone directory will have the telephone numbers of the whole population from whom you want to collect the data, and then you will pick up some random numbers, some telephone numbers at random, and then you will call up those numbers and then you will request them to answer your questions. In this case, of course, the respondent will not be writing down his own responses. What will happen is the telecaller who will be calling up the respondent, he will be asking the questions, and based on the responses being provided by the respondent, the telecaller would mark the responses in the response sheet available with him. So this is how you conduct telephonic interviews, telephonic interviewing. Is this okay? And you can understand this probably is going to be the cheapest of all the 4 types that we have discussed so far, because the telecaller is stationed at a particular place. He does not have to go anywhere. He simply will be calling up the respondents. So in that sense it is going to be the cheapest. But then why don't we use telephonic interviews in most of the cases? Why is the use of telephonic interviewing relatively rare? Because please understand, many times what happens is in telephonic interview the respondent does not feel obligated to answer your questions, and it may so happen that he may turn down your request. He may tell you ki boss, I don't have time as of now, so you please call me later, I would not be able to answer your questions. This may happen, and that is why at times we cannot rely on telephone interviewing and we may have to go for face-to-face or door-to-door surveys. In door-to-door surveys, what will happen, since you have visited the respondent and you have knocked at his door and you are interacting face-to-face, he would find it very difficult to turn you away, and that's why he would be more likely, the respondent would be more likely to answer your questions. Is this understood? Okay. Now let us move over to the next type. The next type is called the computer automated telephone surveys. Now what is a computer automated telephone surveys? You understand what automation is? Please understand what automation is. You know already that use of some automatic devices, automatic machines, so they can work on their own. This is what automation is all about. Here, if you remember, in telephone interviewing we would be using a telecaller who would call up the respondent, ask the questions, and then note down the responses. But in this case, what will happen is there would be a pre-recorded human voice which will be fed into the computer. The list of telephone numbers would also be fed into the computer. The computer itself would call up respondents according to that list and then play the pre-recorded human voice. That pre-recorded human voice would be asking questions, and the respondent will have to punch in his responses on his mobile phone or on his telephone number. How will this happen? You might have come across these kind of computer automated telephone surveys. I'm giving an example how it actually happens. If you call up customer care number, what is the first question that you hear? What is the first thing that the customer care executives, and there are no customer care executives generally nowadays, when you first call up a customer care number, it would most likely be a pre-recorded human voice, and it would ask you whether you want to interact in English or in Hindi. And if in case you want to interact in English, you press 1. In case you want to interact in Hindi, you press 2. In case you want to interact in some other language, press 3, and so on and so forth. Now what will you do? Suppose you want to interact in Hindi, you will press 2, and this response would get recorded in the computer at the other end, and then the next question would be put to you in Hindi. So this is an example of a computer automated telephone survey. If you call up a insurance firm, they would first ask you, okay, if you are an existing customer, please type 1 on your mobile screen, on the telephone dial on your mobile screen. And again, if you are If you are not a customer and you are looking forward to buying a policy, then please press 2. If you want to talk to the customer care executive, please press 3. For any other query, please press 4. So supposing you want to talk to the customer care executive, you will have to punch in 3, and this response of yours would get recorded at the other end in the computer. And the next thing that the computer would do is it would route you to a telephone customer care executive. So this is how computer automated telephone surveys you must have witnessed in your dealings with various mobile service providers, also in your dealings with insurance firms, in your dealings with banks also. So these are all examples of computer automated telephone surveys. Now we are moving on to the next one, which is direct computer interviewing. What will happen in a direct computer interviewing? There would be a computer screen which would be placed in a location which is frequented by so many people. It could be placed in a busy market area, it could be placed in a retail store, it could be placed in a dealership, and the questions would be displayed on the computer screen. The respondent will have to look at the computer screen, and then he will mark his responses on the computer screen itself. So there is no requirement of having a field worker there or having a researcher there asking the questions. The questions would be available on the computer screen, and the respondent is simply going to mark his response on the computer screen itself.